Well, welcome to a very important lecture as we're considering the whole issue of is Genesis history. This is the portion I've been promising you, those who are here in the room and those who are out in Facebook land, and that is the statistical analysis that proves that Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 is a narrative. It is a statistical analysis, and I'm going to be giving you the highlights. It is a very interesting analysis, a different way of certainly approaching a Hebrew text. This is not normally done, to do a statistical analysis of a Hebrew text. This investigation then is to distinguish poetry from prose. This is a presentation of research that I did at when I was a member of the RATE team, Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth. And I was the lone Hebraist amongst a group of wonderful geologists and geophysicists and physicists. And I was wondering, how could I contribute to this? And I began looking and thought, I wonder if I can, look at the text and see what we could determine about what kind of text this was, because it's really key to determine the genre, because you can't interpret something correctly until you know the genre of a text, what kind of text it is. Now, we referred to a number of different things as far as this is definitely what we'd call an elusive desideratum. Here's some quotes. The identification of biblical poetry and the definition of what constitutes poetry in the Bible has been a vexed issue since early post-biblical times. Ernst Venlin, what are the features that mark a text as being poetic as distinct from prosaic in nature? The distinction between prose and poetry is important, for it affects how the process of interpreting a given text is carried out, for example, more or less literally, or with greater or lesser emphasis on formal patterning. As much as we would like to do this analysis and to do it the typical way in biblical studies, which is do things in terms of of characteristics, do things qualitatively, there are a number of difficulties. Remember, we really want to know, Del Berlin, who is a poetry scholar, she's saying this is something we really like to be able to tell, the difference between poetry and prose. And from what she says, it seems that we haven't been able to do this yet. Well, my approach was to do it statistically. Okay, here's some difficulties. First of all, there's no word for poetry in biblical Hebrew. Now that's a pretty big obstacle. If there's no even a word for poetry, that's a difficulty. Terms used to describe biblical Hebrew poetry are used inconsistently. They refer to content rather than form. We find, for instance, something called a shir, a song, or a mizmor, which means a praise composition which is accompanied by a plucked stringed instrument. These refer to the content rather than the form of the composition. No contemporary treatises of Hebrew poetry. Do you realize, probably a lot of you do, that Greek poetry was accompanied by a treatise by Aristotle, and he says, this is the way you interpret our poetry. He actually said, this is how you do it. Well, there's no contemporary treatise of Hebrew poetry. So that makes it difficult to know how to do it. We actually have to figure out how to interpret Hebrew poetry by studying the poetry itself. We don't have any outside help. Contemporary outside help. Authors did not label their text. They did not say this is a poem, this is prose, or anything like that. So these are some difficulties. The stachography, that's the way a text is laid out on the page. And of the oldest extant manuscripts, such as one of the oldest and complete manuscripts is the Leningrad Codex, B19A. There is a difference in the stachography of the way it's laid out on the page in Psalms, Job, and Proverbs. In Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, there are 2 columns of texts. In narratives such as Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, and in the book of Kings and other places, there are 3 columns. However, the clearly poetic portions of the scripture, such as large portions of Isaiah's very high-level poetry, are laid out in 3 columns. And then there are other places which are laid out in 2 columns which are not poetic. So this stachography of the oldest extant manuscripts is not reliable. Also, Hebrew has a distinction between that there's 2 different alternate essential systems is used with Job, Proverbs, and Psalms. They uses a different set of accents, okay? But it's only for those 3 books. Isaiah, portions of those sections, Isaiah, and other sections which have heavy poetry use the same essential system as narratives. So it's these are all difficulties. The occurrence of intentional parallelism is not easily quantifiable. We have determined, because of these problems, that the quintessential feature as we study Hebrew poetry is something called parallelism. But it's very difficult to quantify parallelism and say that here we have parallelism, and but here we don't. And so this is, I could say a lot more about that, but this is definitely a difficulty with doing this kind of analysis. Most characteristics of poetry which are described in the literature cannot even be quantified at all, is another difficulty of this analysis. Most characteristics of narrative which are described in the literature cannot be quantified. I mean, how can you quantify this has a plot, this doesn't have a plot, this has character development, this doesn't have character development, and so forth. They're very difficult things to quantify. So the qualitative approach is to recognize there are differences, but boy, I tell you, these things are not clear, and as they're very difficult to do a statistical analysis of. Importance of the setting, place, and time. Of course, these are characteristics of narratives. Focus on character development. Focus on plot. Narratives tend to have a transparency of words. I mean, they're very straightforward. You're looking through a window into the past. Very normal syntax. Word order is normal. Things are normal. And this last one's a little more technical, but the clause length tends to be random in length, whereas with poetry, the clause length is much more balanced and it's bounded. So we have random clause length and very literal language in narrative. Now it's prose, not poetry. So as I looked at this, how could I distinguish these? Could I use morphological distribution, morphological sequences, syntactic structures? What can I use in order to determine the differences between narrative characteristics and poetic characteristics? Clause length, usage of the relative position collocation. These are all different. These are things that narrative has that poetry doesn't, but it's very hard to quantify these. On the other side is poetry. What do we have here? The directions of Hebrew poetry. Okay, there are various different things. Directions of Hebrew poetry is toward the world, toward the poet, toward the poem, toward the reader. But again, how do you quantify that? That's very difficult. The effect of Hebrew poetry makes you use your senses. That's very true. But how can you tell that something makes you use your senses versus a narrative which doesn't make you use your senses, make you use your imagination? Yeah, that's true, but also the same thing is true, seems to be true with prose. Makes you think, not as straightforward as prose. Makes you feel the way the psalmist felt. Well, these are all true about the effect of Hebrew poetry, but very difficult to do an analysis of these things. And maybe we do better here. Okay? What do we have here? These are the poetics. This is how Hebrew poetry does what it does. Opacity. Words are not transparent. The sound of the words and the associations is very important. There's a lot of atypicality. Things are not normal. Extraordinary isometry. There's a lot of balance in Hebrew poetry versus prose. Parallelism. But again, these are difficult things to quantify. Amazing metaphors. Well, how do you quantify that? The Lord is my shepherd. A very famous metaphor. But how do you do that analysis and say over here, it's not a metaphor? Interlocutory shifts. These are another thing. These are areas that has to do with speaking to God and then speaking about God and then coming back again. Those are characteristics of poetry, not prose, but very difficult to quantify. Very pronounced brevity in poetry and highly structured semantic sculpture. These are highly structured texts, these poetic texts. But how do you quantify that? Well, there is a way. This was the name of the chapter I wrote for the RATE project, Statistical Determination of Genre Biblical Hebrew, Evidence for an Historical Reading of Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. Now, any statistical analysis of the Hebrew Bible should have these features. First of all, the data must be sound. The sample size must be adequate according to the statistical specifications. Now, I am not a statistician. I worked with 2 statisticians to make sure that I did it right. Very often in biblical studies and outside of biblical studies, people do not follow these principles. And as a result, their results, as a result of that, they don't come up with the correct analysis. They derive false conclusions. The data must conform to the assumptions of the statistical texts used to analyze the data. And accurate calculations and computer manipulations must be done. That last one, there are certain programs, statistical analysis programs, which are they're very, very expensive. No way that I could possibly afford them. But I worked with one of my statisticians, became one of the top statisticians at Amazon. Then he had access to the very best statistical analysis software on the market. And he used that to do this analysis. And we come up with valid conclusions. So this is all very important in terms of the statistical analysis of the Hebrew Bible. Now the question is, if you're going to do a statistical analysis, what are you going to analyze? And these are the possibilities: morphological distribution. In other words, what do verbs look like? What do nouns look like? Word order, clause length. I eliminated morphological sequences. I said I can't do that. Syntactic structures, can't do that. So I began to eliminate these things. And through the process of elimination, and also uses the relative position of collocation, through the process of elimination, I came upon morphological distribution. I said, that's what I have to do. And these other ones, I said, I can't do those. So if we're going to do morphological distribution, what are we going to do to look at? I said, I know, we can look at finite verbs. Now, finite verbs are verbs that indicate the person, okay, that is first, second, and third person. I, you, he, she, it, so forth. Also, number, singular and plural, and gender, masculine and feminine, okay? So those are the kind of verbs. The reason why I looked at those verbs is because those are the kind of verbs that occur in both narrative and poetry. And since they are concerned with person as well as gender and number, these lend themselves to stories, to talking about character development. So we have finite verbs is what we're going to look at. Now, okay, that was fine. My statistician didn't know a lick of Hebrew, didn't know anything at all. And he said, okay, look at finite verbs. Which ones? So what we did was, we looked at all the different possibilities of the finite verbs. He tested all of these different things, and he found out, after we looked at all of these things, and these are the 4 different kinds of finite verbs: the vayiktol, the katal, the vakatal, and the yiktol. I know they're foreign words to you guys, but these are the 4 kinds of finite verbs. So he did all kinds of plots of these. And here's the questions we had to ask. And he says you have to start in a statistical analysis with asking questions. Does the finite verb distribution in biblical Hebrew vary with genre, poetry versus narrative? That was a question. A second question is this: if it does, can this distribution reliably predict the genre of any text? In other words, going in the other direction, if we know what the distribution is, okay, can we then use that to predict the genre? That's where I wanted to go. If so, what are the implications of this? The biblical authors believe that they're writing about real events. That, of course, we've already gone over. And so we're going to look then at we call it exploratory phase. And what I did for this section is I picked. People are going to go, oh, you picked texts? Yeah, but in exploratory phase, the whole idea of exploratory phase is this research worth pursuing at all? If I take texts and pick them, I say, I know this is poetry, I know this is narrative, and so forth, and I wanted to look at them, and this is all color coordinated. So the green color, that's vayiktol, okay? The red is yiktol, the yellow is katal, and the blue is vakatal, okay? And so I said, okay, I've got these 14 texts, and I said, what happens when I look at narratives versus poetry? Okay? Now watch this difference. This is amazing. This is narrative. That's poetry. Isn't that a huge difference? Look at those the green things just drop. You ain't seen nothing yet. Okay. This is so dramatic. The statistician was just amazed at this stuff. Now this is really interesting. This is some paired text. In other words, texts that occur referring to the same event, and yet one we have a poetic account of it, and the other one is a narrative account. Okay, so notice in the first one, let me bring up quickly my little pointer. We look at this first text right here, Exodus 14. That is the account of the crossing of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptian army. Okay? Exodus 15, it's referring to exactly the same event. And, oops, wait a minute, go back. It's referring to exactly the same event. And in Exodus 15, it's a poetic account of it. Look how different the colors are in this plot. Judges 4 is the account of Deborah and Barak fighting against the Canaanites, and the famous scene when Yael gives Sisera, the commander of the army, a really bad headache by dropping a tent peg through his. Okay, that's in Judges 4, and then Judges 5 is called the Song of Deborah. It is the poetic account. Look how different they are, referring to the same events. Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. This is I just threw this thing in there. Versus Psalm 104. Psalm 104, most people would recognize, is a poetic account of the creation. And then I have the flood and Psalm 105, 106 in there, just for comparison purposes. But in terms of these parallel texts, these are very striking in terms of how different they are, the poetic account versus the narrative account. Now, I was introduced to a number of different statistical techniques. It's interesting that Kurt Wives is talking about cluster plots and cluster analysis. This is one of the things my statistician suggested. He says, what we're going to do is we're just going to take the data in terms of characteristics of them, We're not going to mention the names. We're not going to mention the different kinds of verbs. We're just going to do a cluster analysis and see if we can get groupings. Well, this was quite amazing, okay? Because cluster 1, those are all the narrative texts, okay? They're all the narrative texts in cluster 1. In cluster 2 and 3, they are the poetic texts. And my statistician asked me a question. He says, this cluster analysis shows that there's 2 different kinds of poetic texts. He says, why is that? And I said, you got me by the sneakers. I have no idea. This is something obviously for further research. You just don't know where it's going to go, right? But this does show in the cluster plot that there really is a difference based upon these finite verb types between narrative and poetry. So in other words, the whole point of this is all exploratory. We're on to something here. This is good. Then he said, well, okay, let's take this evidence of these texts you've done and see what we can do. And he said, let's try what's called a logistic regression analysis. I said, fine. I have no idea what that is. And so I had to then find out what it was and do research to study up on it. But what logistic regression analysis is, if you have 2 different possibilities and you have a finite number of times where you're choosing the 2 different possibilities, how does it plot out? And this is how it plotted out. And he was so amazed with the data I given him. And he says, this is so square. He says, but when we actually do the analysis, it's really going to flatten out. Don't worry. It's not going to stay like this. All right. Then we go to the confirmatory phase. In the confirmatory phase, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but these are all the steps I had to go through that actually he made me go through, okay, to do this. And so what we had to do is one summer I went through my English Bible, this is very important, my English Bible, and I simply went through, and according to the way that they were laid out on the page, I just identified it. I said, okay, they're considering that poetry, this is narrative, and so forth and so on. Went through the whole Old Testament, okay? And so I identified all of these texts, 522 texts, into 2 groups, okay? Now, this step here is very important. I'm going to, again, try this with the laser pointer, okay, right here. This is a very important step. Right there. Generate a random sample, okay? The way we did with this is I just had a number for each of the texts. Each of the narratives and each of the poetic texts had a number, 522. And I just gave him, and I said, what? There's a certain number of poetic texts, there's a certain number of narrative texts. And I said, so there's a range of numbers for each of those. Now, generate a random sample of numbers for each of those, totally random. We had to do it a second time because it didn't sample certain other texts, and it didn't sample what were called the former prophets enough. And I said, is there such a way that we can do it to make sure that we do pick up each of the parts of the Old Testament? We actually pick up the Torah. We do pick up the former prophets, latter prophets, and the writings. He says, oh yes, it's called a stratigraphic random sample. I said, well, we need to do that thing then. I had no idea what he's talking about, but we need to do that. And so he gave me these numbers. That's all he gave me, numbers, randomly generate numbers. And he says, these are the texts you should study. See, I didn't pick the texts. He told me which text to study. That's very important. Okay? So now what I have to do is, of the texts he told me to study, based upon the random sample, I had to count the preterites, the same as the viactols, the imperfects, that's the same as the ictols, the perfects, that's the same as scatals, and the va perfects, that's the same as vocatals for each text. And I used BibleWorks to do that. Okay? To do this experiment would have been absolutely impossible. Well, it would have taken years and years and years to do this kind of analysis. But the computer, I just entered in, I said, I want to know how many viactols are in this text, and boom, out it comes. And so I had all these tables generated. And so what he did was he said, okay, let's find out which of these is best. And we calculated different ratios. Preterites, I mean, that's the viactols to these types of verbs. Preterites to preterites plus imperfects. Preterites to imperfects and preterites to perfects. And he generated charts and so forth for all of these to find out which was the best thing to use as our model. I didn't know, okay? It turns out that the best model was to have the viactols over all the finite verbs, and thus have a relative frequency of this particular type of verb. The next step was to test the hypothesis that the distributions of these ratios prove that narrative texts have a different distribution from poetic texts and therefore are an objective determiner of genre. And we did some graphical analysis, and I'll show you those too as well. So let's get to some of this. Now, here's the idea. You have 522 texts, 295 are narrative, 227 are poetry. Okay? From that, Roger had me generate this random sample. Okay, 97 texts, 48 narrative, 49 poetry. Okay, so that's the one we're going to use for the analysis. Now, any statistical analysis has to be couched in terms of what's called null hypotheses. You basically assume the opposite of what you're trying to prove. Since I am trying to show that finite verb distribution in Biblical Hebrew does vary with genre, the hypothesis is that it doesn't vary with genre. Okay, it's called the null hypothesis. And the classification models fit the distribution. Preterites do not do better than random results, and these were an informal null hypotheses. As a matter of fact, when I wrote these up, I thought, wow, these sound so cool. I'm there. And he said, oh, no, you're not. You have to be much more specific than that. I said, okay, give me an idea what's going on here. All right, now, from that random data, now we'll go back to the hypotheses in just a second. From that random data, this is what the narrative looks like. Okay, you ready for this one? This is poetry. Okay, see that again? Narrative, poetry. Think we can make something out of that? All right, now, actually, I am really proud of this slide because this is the plot that I generated. Okay, I actually generated this plot. After we did all this work, he realized, he says, well, you've got a finite number of verbs, and there was a constraint. He says, you can only look at passages with 30 verbs or more. Okay, so I said, okay. And he said, but there's another thing, all the analysis we were doing of p-types and all kinds of other things, can't do that. What you have to do is just do a plot of the random samples and give what's called the median for your narrative samples and the median for poetry, and show visually frequency of 0.52, and the other one 0.04. Huge difference. Okay, now, of course, there is an outlier on poetry and an outlier on narrative. You can see it below the 0.20 line on narrative and between 0.5 and 0.4 on poetry. And there's a reason for that, and that is I misidentified one of the poetries, and there was also an issue with narrative. But it also proves that the model worked. It caught those things. You see, it caught it, which was really good. And now we had to come up with the real null hypothesis. And this is what it was. And it's really boring. All logistic regression and classification models derived from the relative frequency of viactols classified text by genre no better than random results. Now let me put that in simple terms, okay? All logistic regression and classification models derived from the relative frequency of the viactols, that's what we decided to count, don't do any better than flipping a coin, okay? That's random results, right? So this was the null hypothesis. Now, the opposite of this is called the alternative hypothesis. So if the null hypothesis turns out to be false, then you have this. There is a logistic regression classification model derived from the relative frequency of preterites, which classify text by genre better than random results. Aha. Okay. Now, get back to show you this again. Population. There it is. Here's our random sample. And this is what the random sample generated. Remember he said, well, when we actually get to the random sample, that curve is not going to be as steep. Well, this is almost as steep. This is a very important diagram. The red squares at the bottom, they represent, of course, the actual fact that those texts were poetry. Okay, the green diamonds, those are the ones that were actually narrative. Okay, but the curve is the logistic regression curve. And the idea here is that if it's to the left of that dotted vertical line, then it should be classified as poetry. And you can see that it did a really good job. There's only one outlier out between 0.4 and 0.6. And in terms of classifying as narrative, it's to the right of that dotted line. And you can see there's only one outlier. Now, this is just a little table showing you how successful the model was. Out of 48 poetic texts, the model, out of 49 poetic texts, the model correctly identified 48 of them. Okay? Out of the narrative texts, 48 narrative texts, the model correctly identified 47 of them. And I was really crushed when I saw this. I said, oh, it wasn't perfect. And the statistician said, he says, you should be thankful that it's not. He says, because if it was perfect, no one would believe your results. He says, at least you got 48 and 1 and 47 and 1. He says, this is wonderful. This is exactly what, this is amazing. Matter of fact, he said to me, why did you even need me? He says, these results are so striking that you don't even need me. You don't need a statistician. Another statistician came in on the scene as well. And this is when, I thought I was done at this point. I said, oh, there I am. Perfect. This is great. Oh, no, you're not done. Because all you've done so far is show that the random sample has this characteristic. Okay? And by design, Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, which I was studying, cannot be in the random sample. Okay, it can't be in there. So how do you get it into the picture? Well, this is where the mathematics comes in. How do you go from statistics, which deal with specific things you're measuring for a random sample, to parameters, which is moving it to the level of the population? Extending the analysis to text outside the sample. This is where the mathematics came in, and my second statistician was a mathematician as well. And so this is the idea. Okay, you have the 97 texts. Now we have to go from the random sample. Now notice the arrow is going back the other direction to the population. Well, this is what we have to do. This is visually. How many random samples can be generated from 522 texts where 295 are narrative and 227 are poetry? That, with the characteristic that the random samples have to have 97 texts with 48 narrative and 49 poetry. Well, obviously there's millions of them, and this is just 4. But mathematically, we can generate them all. And then go from statistics to parameters, from sample to population. That's the idea. So now we can test the null hypothesis that that the proportion of the number of errors reduced is no better than 1/2. That's the idea, okay? And this is what we came up with. The probability that a random sample drawn from the population would have a proportion of error reduction of 0.0206 when the average proportion is 0.5. If the null hypothesis is true, in other words, if this model does no better, if this model based upon Viator relative frequency does no better than random, that would mean that the coin toss. If the hypothesis is true, what is the probability that that would be the case? The probability is 6 times 10 to the minus 26th, okay? That's a very low number, very low number. There are 6, I think 0.02 times 10 to the 23rd atoms in a mole of gas. So this is, as Avogadro's number, this is now on the order of 1,000 times more than Avogadro's number. So this is such a tiny number. So so what this shows is that the null hypothesis is not true. All right? Therefore, we reject the null hypothesis and can accept the alternative hypothesis. What was that? Null hypothesis to be tested is to remind you all logistic regression classification models derive from the relative frequency of preterites, classify text by genre, no better than random results. Okay? The alternative hypothesis, and this time I'm going to do it in terms of Viator. There's a logistic regression classification model derived from the relative frequency of preterites / Viator, same thing, which classifies text by genre better than random results. So there is a logistic regression model. Now, again, my statistician, Roger, said, now, Steve, he says, be careful, but don't be too greedy here, okay? Don't ask for too high of a confidence level. Just be satisfied with a 90% or something like that. I said, no, I want 99.5. And so we can calculate a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of error reduction due to our model. And you can read all about this in the chapter, much more detail. That is, we can be certain that the average proportion of error reduction is between 0.8550 and 0.995. In other words, our model is an excellent classifier of text. And Roger said, now look, don't be greedy, right? Don't be greedy. He says, if you are greedy and want this 99 this very high 99.5% confidence, he says that's going to flatten that curve out, and it's not going to be pretty. And I said, okay. I said, we're going to go for it anyway. All right? Now, what we have here is with the software he had available now, is he was able to generate the band of all possible curves for all possible random samples of 97 texts with that particular proportion of 48 and 49, okay? And this is the ratio of Viators to total finite verbs. Now notice up in the upper right-hand corner, the yellow triangle. The yellow triangle, that is now Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. To the left of those vertical lines in the middle, any text is classified as poetry. To the right of that, classified as narrative. Notice where Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 is. So now let's bring it to the issue. 522 texts, 295 narrative, 227 poetry represents the entire Hebrew Bible, the entire Old Testament. That's the population. We had a logistic band shows a 99.5% confidence interval for the probability the text is a narrative. Here it comes. The range of probability in this case at a 99.5% confidence interval for Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 at this confidence level is as follows. The probability is between 0.99, 9942, and 0.999987. Now, the nature of statistics is that all results are stated in terms of probabilities. So strictly speaking, we can say that with two choices for the genre of Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, poetry or narrative, this text is narrative, not poetry, with a very high degree of probability. Or to put results in scientific terms, the text is a narrative with statistical certainty. In other words, it is statistically indefensible to argue that this text is poetry. Now, I want to add something to this. We use a statistical analysis, and therefore we have a range between 0.999942 and 0.999987. Science comes up with statistical possibilities. Okay? That's the way these analyses are done. So we've done this now examining a Hebrew text using a scientific method, statistical analysis. But the reality is that in life, there are such things as zeros and ones. Okay? We can say it's 0.999942 and between 0.999987. But the reality is it's 1. It really is. It's 1. There are certain things that are impossible, and such as going under 11-foot-8 railroad bridge with a 13-foot high truck. And you can do that for 1 billion, trillion, quadrillion Google years, and it will never go underneath that bridge. Okay? That is 0. But there's also the possibility of 1. And this is that. So, now, I told you there's a limitation to this. The limitation is you have to have 30 verbs or more. So this works for passages with 30 verbs or more. So after I did this analysis, someone who was on the board at the Master's College, he's now passed on, came to me and said, Dr. Boyd, according to your analysis, what would you think of Genesis 7:11b? Genesis 7:11b talks about the fountains of the great deep splitting open or bursting open, and the wind apertures of heaven opening up. And I said, I'm sorry, Bill, my analysis doesn't apply here. I have to have 30 verbs. That only has 2. So I began thinking, how can I extend this analysis to very low counts? And that's one of the things we're working on now in the CCRG project. We're trying to see other features that can be added to this analysis, such as clause length and other things like that. Because there are these very specific things that happen in the Hebrew Bible when the author wants to emphasize something. He switches from narrative to a very short piece of poetry and then back again. I call these NPN switches. And the idea of NPN switches is we'll be able to, we look enough of them, we'll be able to see what happens to that change from narrative to poetry and back again. And that is one of the, I think, very interesting. We're all starting to get some very interesting results from that analysis. And then we hope to be able to take that data and have it analyzed by a process called data analytics, a very sophisticated way of analyzing data to determine at a much finer grid the difference between poetry and prose. So I could answer Bill's question. But I can't do it now. But we can do it for passages 30 verbs or more. So I think this is a very, very powerful model, not just for Genesis 1 through 2, 3. It can be applied to anything. You can take a passage, as long as it has 30 verbs, you can apply it to the flood narrative, you can apply it to any place you want, as long as 30 verbs or more, and you can be assured that you will have a 99.5% statistical accuracy, and I think it's a very powerful model. Now, where do we go from here? Actually, I've already done it. But where we go from here is, now that we know it's a narrative, well, so what? It's a narrative. The thing about that is, once we know it's a narrative, now we look at the characteristics of narratives. And we see those 15 points that show us that if it's a narrative, then the author believed he was writing real history. And he also presents his material that way. So you can see the picture. You can see how it fits together. You prove that it's a narrative. Then, because it's a narrative, it's a historical narrative. And part of that proof is our belief in inspiration. If he believed he's writing real history and he presents it that way, then since we believe in inspiration, we must take it that way. And there is no other alternative. When I look at this text based upon this analysis, there is no other way to read this text other than recognizing that it's a historical narrative. Indeed, Genesis is history. Thank you.